So I decided for this video that I was going to change things up just a bit. I'm going to be approaching this video with a little less quote-unquote like inflection in my voice. I just kind of wanted to experiment by using something, a little closer to my normal voice as opposed to my, like YouTube voice. Let me know what you guys think of it. Do you like it more? Do you hate it? Or is it any different? Let me know in a comment below or whatever. Anyways, with that out of the way, what are we doing here today? Well, I'm going to be attempting to complete the main storyline of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 while keeping Henry perpetually in the negative phase of drunkenness as much as humanly possible. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 Vagabond Run. Okay, so what are the rules and challenges for this run? Well, the main thing I was focused on balancing was, like I said earlier, keeping Henry in a constant state of being drunk. I also wasn't going to be washing off any filth I'd accumulate over time unless I had to. I limited ethical merchanting, and my only means of acquiring better gear was to have it gifted to me or finding it on a fallen enemy. Now, I mentioned earlier that I'd be maintaining a negative phase of drunkenness, right? So what does that actually mean exactly? Well, there are two phases of drunkenness in Kingdom Come 2. Positive and negative. The positive phase is generally tied to any perks you might pick up in the skill tree and generally has net benefits. And the negative phase can get into things like blurry vision, a swaying camera, and stat penalties. The main stats that would be impacted here are strength, speech, vitality, and charisma. These will suffer up to a -2 while in the negative phase, depending on how drunk Henry is at the time. And now that we have a better idea of what this run is striving to accomplish, let's get into it.
Keep firing!
Oh, and real quick, the last time I played through this, I know I kind of skimmed over the plot and such just to kind of, get through the game because it had just came out and all that. But this time I actually slowed down and fully immersed myself into it. So there may be a few times in this video where I break off into a random thought about the game itself or something that I liked that I wanted to highlight. But either way, anyways, let's get into the video. I began my journey into this new hardcore mode by first selecting every one of the 10 negative perks available to me, as it's kind of my preferred way to play. And when first starting this game, it actually places us in the shoes of Godwin, who's somehow wrapped up in the middle of a siege defense. At this point, we have no clue what the hell is going on, and it's just pure chaos. In this sequence, we get to see that Hans is also here, but there is never any sign of Henry. Since this scene is a bit of a spoiler to the happenings of the future, I'm gonna kind of skip over this part now, and we'll go over it more later in the video. After the opening sequence is capped off, we jump back in time a bit to a short time after the ending of the first game. Henry is accompanying Hans on an official errand at Troskowitz to deliver a message to the Lord there, von Berghoff. As we made our way along, less than a day away from the castle now, we wind up running into the captain of the Trotsky Guard, Thomas, as we were about to wrap up our day of riding and set up camp for the night. I accidentally mixed up my role in the troop by first reporting that I was a scribe, and then literally just a few seconds later saying that I was a knight. This didn't help quell Thomas's suspicions in the slightest. But thankfully, Hans is there to talk his way out of trouble with this group and proceeds to order us to set up camp in a wide open area next to this pond that we were stopped at. After getting the basics of combat down with Hans, we decided to strip down to our boxers and wash off the grime from weeks of riding. And as we washed off in the pond, we heard some voices that Hans would immediately identify as female, though almost instantly after finding what we thought was a dream, quickly turned into a nightmare. In that moment, bandits would come out of the tree line and begin raiding our camp, killing our men and setting their sights on these women. Henry, trying to help, causes their attention to be directed at us, forcing us to flail our way across the river, catching us straight to the shoulder in the process. Now, for obvious reasons, there's not much in terms of alcohol in these first few moments of the story, so I'm just gonna kinda skim past them. I know I said I wouldn't really do that, but I'm gonna cover the important things right now. Hans and I would sneak our way through this rocky terrain and around all the bandits looking for us, but just as we thought we made a clean break, we were attacked by a single enemy, ending in Henry taking a terrible fall. Hans would end up finding me and carrying me, like a true friend should, all the way over to the nearest cottage he could find in search of help. Thankfully, this turned out to be an herbalist's home, and she was talented enough to restore me back to health, though the Lethian water she gave me would end up taking a few of my levels away as a result. Even though I'd now recovered, Hans was still in critical condition. I was sent by Bajenza to fetch some herbs up the hill to turn into a marigold decoction for him. But first, doing Bajenza the courtesy of taking care of the body of the bandit that Hans managed to fight off. Coming back to the cottage from my herb-picking adventure, there were now 2 men out in front with Bajenza. I tried ambushing them at first to take them out immediately, but that got shut down rather quickly. But on my second attempt, I would manage to punch the first one up to the point of getting him to flee, and after chasing him down to finish him off with my weapon, I turned to take care of his buddy. After dealing with them, I made up the marigold decoction, washed the blood off my clothes, then before getting some more rest, I handed the potion off to Bajenza. I woke up again from my slumber to a lovely girl named Pavlena. I got up, stepped outside, and saw that Hans had made a full recovery and clearly had a new lease on life. We then sat around the table for a little while, telling a few stories before thanking the women and leaving back off to Troskowitz. And Hans and I would go on to get hilariously rejected by the guards of Trotsky Castle for trying to pass off for noblemen when dressed as filthy beggars. They weren't having any of our perceived lies. We'd end up retreating back to a small town of Troskowitz to rethink our strategy. We landed ourselves at a table at a local tavern, smelling like shit and offending the other patrons, and with no coin to his name and being treated like a peasant repeatedly, Hans was reaching his breaking point, and I was sensing he was about to explode. But I didn't have time for that right now, as the chick with the huge jugs I stayed down by the pond had just entered the chat. Well, I guess it's only one huge jug. Not to mention those humongous tits. I drank all the alcohol I had on me before beginning these opening cutscenes, so I was getting increasingly drunk as I stood next to her waiting for my chance to talk. She shrugged me off as if she'd never seen me before, which I found pretty suspicious, but there was nothing I could do about it right now, and it was time to work off our debt to the tavern. I remember that by the time I got around to hauling about the 3rd sack of flour inside, I was what I would think to be considered absolutely plastered. And of course, as I called it, after leaving the tavern to get my 4th sack, Hans was outside making a scene and blowing up on some locals. This put me in a situation that forced me to take on another one of Hans's battles, and I tried desperately to land some decent punches. Surprisingly enough, I did fairly well at first, managing to take out 2 of the 4 men attacking us, but then I got ganked by those other 2 men and ended up in the stocks for being a part of this disturbance. And real quick, I just wanted to go back and point this out, but during this fight, you can get a quick glimpse of the fighting style I'd eventually develop strictly for this run. So, although we were apparently locked up in the stocks, if you're as drunk as I was here, Henry is evidently loose enough to slip out of them, but is still a good enough friend that he still stood by Hans and would sit idly by as he'd be berated for somehow being the one who'd get us into this mess. Okay, buddy. I even tried to reconcile with this child, but the bastard was much too high on his horse to accept it. In the next morning, we'd be let out of the stocks, and I was still just as drunk as when I entered them. Nice. From here, I'd beg for 5 groschen from the beggar, who'd claim to make some serious money due to the attention I drew, and I used it to buy a couple of cheap wines before stealing a horse from the stables and setting off to Takov. I personally prefer to do the blacksmith's questline to get into the wedding, so I came here to talk to him, show him what I could do with the forge, and get given a personal bed while I'm at it. After showing him what I was worth, the blacksmith would clue me in on a cart that he had go missing somewhere off the main road to Apollonia, and requested that I team up with the Lord of Samine in hopes of finding and retrieving it. After arriving in Samine and introducing myself, I asked if they had any horses for me to ride the following morning on our search. They pointed me in the direction of their stables, saying that they didn't really have any to spare per se, but mentioning that they may have a horse to sell me. And it turns out this stable boy had my pebbles, and he would sell her to me, I guess, for the low price of 60 groschen. Indeed, I was flat broke right now, so I did end up having to head on down to the miller's, carry some heavy-ass bags of flour for him, then I was able to sell my stolen items to him. I safely stole everything I could, broke my back several times gathering herbs, then sold everything that I had for a whopping 76 groschen. Perfect. On my way back to Samine, I came across one of those randomly generated convoys that was being attacked by some scrappy bandits. Now obviously the bandits would go on to lose that fight, and I'd be able to harvest their bodies for some extra supplies and money. I'd get back to the stable boy, haggle him down to 57 groschen, and bought my pebbles back. I slept until the next morning to heal up, then regrouped with Lord Samine and Gnarly in the courtyard. We set off to locate the missing cart, but stopped off for a duel against Gnarly that I'd inevitably win, then again in Troskowitz to speak with the bailiff about where the cart may have been traveling. When examining the road along the way, I found a bag of charcoal that looked to have fallen off the cart we were looking for. Just inside the tree line, there'd be a path, hidden by some overgrowth, and this is where I'd find it. As we explored around the rocks for clues as to what may have happened, we'd come across some bandits nearby talking rather loudly. These must be the men who hijacked the cart. They absolutely sucked at fighting, and after they'd surrendered, we discovered that the driver of the caravan, Venza, was indeed involved in the theft of this product. The next group of enemies we'd come across were really no better at fighting than the first, and were also put down in mere seconds. I chased down and killed the fleeing coward Venza for his crimes against the blacksmith, then the remaining criminals were taken into town to pay for their crimes, and I was off to report back to the blacksmith. I sold a few things I had on me to him for some extra coin, which I'd just turn right around and spend at the tavern, buying them clean out of their alcohol stock, forgetting that this stuff, I know, has a spoil timer. After getting sufficiently drunk off some nearly expired beer, I was now off to the outskirts of Apollonia once again to look for the hermit and his sword. The blacksmith needed a gift to bring to the wedding, and if I could secure this fine piece of steel, he'd let me be his +1. I hadn't yet fully integrated the no washing rule, so this would be one of the rare times you'll see this Henry somewhat presentable. I talked to the alehouse maid, whom Hans and I owed an apology to find out more information on where the hermit may like to hang out. I was incredibly drunk, borderline blacking out when I set off in this quest, and the blurry vision wasn't doing me any favors on locating any familiar landmarks in the area. So I stumbled around in a haze until I'd finally sober up enough to see somewhat clearly. Then I'd found my way to the road I was looking for, and eventually to the hermit's grave. His sword had been broken and shoved into the ground to mark it, and I grabbed it to report my findings to the blacksmith. I'm not gonna lie, I did get a little turned around when trying to get back to Takov, but eventually would stumble into Troskowitz, and I was able to navigate back from here. After showing the blacksmith what happened to the sword, as well as telling him what happened to the hermit, he tasked me with being the one to forge the piece of steel into something fit for a lord. Henry could barely stand up straight while talking with this dude, and he wanted me to be the one to forge the sword correctly. If I was a gambling man, I would bet that this guy was a gambling man. Now, despite my impairment, I was actually able to hammer a fine blade out of that former hunk of Toledo steel. Now, time for the hard part. Dressing for the wedding. Henry is a vagabond who's only ever known wearing mud-covered gambesons and bloody-soaked hose. How was he ever going to clean up enough for this wedding? Especially with the constant debuff to his charisma. If I remember correctly, the blacksmith won't agree that you're properly fit to attend to the wedding until your charisma is at least, 16, I think. It's either 15 or 16. Either way, Henry's was currently... After heading back to Troskowitz and knocking out the tailor there to steal his keys, I got to work picking out each article of clothing that had the highest boost to charisma I could, and I thought this was going to be an easy enough task from here. But still, after getting Henry some new drip, his charisma was still only a pitiful 9. An improvement for sure, but still not great. Even after stealing everything from the shop's chest and picking out the best options using this alternative method, I still couldn't budge past 9. So I played my last-ditch Hail Mary, and I made up some lion perfumes, slept off my buzz, washed up once again before stocking up on alcohol at the tavern, spritzing on the lion perfume, and officially getting my charisma up to 16. Nice. Now it was time to talk to the blacksmith and head off to the wedding at Samine. Henry gets along perfectly at this wedding. There's a ton of booze, a few fair maidens, and friends to laugh the night away with. Funnily enough, I would bump elbows with the dude I got in a brawl with back at the tavern, and we'd make up fairly quickly. We'd come together in our collective desire to see his friend Wojtek fail at picking up one of the single girls at the wedding. I made a wager with the two men that I could do much better, and they took me up on it. I went over there and tried my approach of trying to get him to leave her the hell alone, and taking the angle of the nice guy, offering not only for him to leave her alone, but both of us. This caught her attention, apparently, and she wanted to speak with me in private. After finding some privacy, she asked me a bit about where I'm from, which parlays eventually into asking me to dance. To which I declined, since I wasn't interested in dancing, I just wanted more booze. I decided to then convene with Lord Samine, as I agreed to help him around this wedding. I was to first help the guard by either shooing away the beggars or getting them some food. I chose the compassionate route and got them some scraps of food off the banquet table as well as the kitchen. I was wasted, but I still managed to get the job done. Time ticked by and the evening went on. Yurko would call me over and request that I obtain some real alcohol for him from the cellars. There was supposedly some real good shit down there, and somehow I was the only one equipped to get it. I lured the guard away using my gift of the silver tongue, and I was able to get into the cellar to retrieve the legendary Moravian schnapps. After getting the alcohol back to Yurko, I met back up with the blacksmith who'd gotten so drunk that he'd lost the present to the newlyweds. I'd quickly find it shoddily hidden in the shallow end of the pond where I'd talked with Merker earlier, and after finding this, the wedding ceremony would commence for a brief moment before immediately returning back to a party. From here, I wanted to congratulate the two newlyweds, but only found the bride crying alone in the cellar. I tried consoling her as best as I could, but got barged in on by a man who'd I'd made a not so friendly impression on earlier, and what he saw didn't look too good. Though, it really wasn't what it seemed. This causes him to go stir up the drunken guests of the party into a brawl, which I'd happily take part in. Drunken brawls are my favorite. We'd hard cut to a familiar looking area where we're treated to a glimpse of what's going on at Uschitz at the time, and found the two noblemen Radzik and Hanush currently looking for a clearly off the wagon Father Godwin. They explained to him the situation on how Hans and Henry should have been back from their errand by now, and were requesting that he would set off to go look for him. Basically, a medieval welfare check. This was important to set up since the next thing we know, the two of them are locked up in the Kuttenberg dungeon, assumedly due to the ruckus caused in Samine. But it turns out, Hans was in far deeper shit. As Henry's being let out to work off his crimes, we found out that Hans had been charged with poaching, which carries the death penalty. Even though he is a nobleman and what he did was technically legal, they don't know that, and I needed to find a way to get him out. My mandatory job was to haul 3 sacks of charcoal up the hill and into a designated shed, which was a simple enough task. After finishing up, I was told to report to the blacksmith, only to find out that he was a total dick. Killing him with kindness, I agreed to finish up the last horseshoe he needed to give back to the stable hand, and learning from my last run, I exhausted this stable hand's dialogue so I'd have access to purchasing some lockpicks. And after robbing a few coin pouches lying around, I'd have enough to purchase a single one. This very much came in handy when I'd make my way up to the apothecary's workstation and break into his chest to collect all the herbs I'd need to make a fever tonic. I'd use this alchemy bench in here to make up just what I needed to cure Thomas, and just as I was setting off to give it to him, I was stopped by the guards for loitering. I didn't have enough gold to pay off this debt, and I couldn't be punished or else Hans would be hanged. So I had to use my silver tongue once again, and spun a good enough story for the guard that I passed his speech check and he let me off with a warning. I continued on from here towards the crone, and just as I was about to ascend the tower up to Thomas, I was nearly caught by another guard on his way down. Thankfully, I was able to quickly backtrack and hide, but just as I was about to make a break for it again, I was spotted by one of the housemaids and she began to cry out that I was trespassing. So Instead, I full-on sprinted up the steps of the crone, delivered the fever tonic to Thomas, and saved the day for Hans. Except, I didn't. The Chamberlain wasn't willing to accept that Thomas was healthy enough to be talking any sense, and was just about to send Hans swinging before von Berghoff came bursting through the gates and put a stop to all this madness. And thank God, we'd finally gotten our audience with the fabled nobleman and got to deliver our message. Now, he rebuts our message with a dilemma of his own. These bandits we've been hearing about have been causing a huge headache for von Berghoff, and asks of us to deliver another message to Nabokov asking them for aid. We, thinking this is in our best interest, oblige, and set off to Nabokov the next morning. I ended up being too drunk, poor, and lazy to do any of the activities offered in Nabokov while I waited for Hans to finish his meeting, so after having a drink with Michael, I simply waited until Hans was done. We traveled back to Trotsky and relayed the message of how many men Jaromir was willing to lend, and he responds by telling us that they've managed to capture one of the bandits and had him held prisoner down in the dungeon. Von Berghoff's men haven't been able to quite crack this prisoner's will yet, so he suggested that we give it a shot. Quite a left turn, but alright. Oh, and I informed him of the curious actions of the young Samine on the night of his wedding after he'd asked if we'd seen anything suspicious, though I probably shouldn't have let that slip. Now that Hans and I were down by the dungeon trying to extract what we could out of the prisoner, I tried my best to handle this without any violence, but the man just wouldn't budge. So I did need to show him what I had written on the back of my hand a few times, and after a little twist to the balls with the tongs, he'd finally give in. In this playthrough, I did want to save Samine, but it seems by letting it slip earlier that the son of the Lord took off during the night of his wedding, von Berghoff wasn't convinced in my attempt to cover up their involvement with the bandits. He sent us alongside his right-hand man Heshek to Samine to investigate and learn what young Samine was up to. I've been down this road before, but this time I wasn't going to let Heshek bully me into torching this place and slaughtering its people. So, when Hashek became inconsolable about bringing Olda in to face justice and wanting to just burn it all down, Hans and I stepped in to object, which led to a fight amongst the very men we came here with. I equipped the only weapon I had on me in the moment and fought to protect the innocent people of Samine. Unfortunately, now we needed to cover our tracks. Lord Samine and his people had somewhere safe to go and lie low, but how would we explain ourselves to von Berghoff? Well, we had to come up with a pretty convincing lie, and in the end, Samine still ended up in flames. But at least we saved the people, right? Now, after getting back to Trotsky Castle and resting for the night, I woke up to find myself no longer in my bed. Ah, yes, one of the lovely negative perks reminding us that they exist. Okay, after getting my bearings and eventually figuring out where I was, I could get back on track and onto the current quest. One thing that I really love about the layout of this map versus the map of KCD1 is the fact that there's a giant-ass castle on a hill near the middle of the map, making this an easy landmark to reference my position, especially in hardcore mode when I'm not shown on the map. Anyway, after walking up and tossing back a few shots of schnapps, I mounted my horse and began riding back to Trotsky Castle. Time to meet with von Berghoff and hope to God he believes the lie we're about to spin. Well, the lie Hans was about to spin, as I was gonna let him do all the explaining. I mean, is he really gonna believe that all his men died, Samine was dealt with, and he and I were the only two remaining people still standing? This story sounds suspicious as hell. Also, real quick again, Drunk Henry, at least in some of these more serious cutscenes, is one of the most hilarious things I think I've seen in this game. Minus some pretty crazy glitches I've come across. We did come back with some pretty important news, and I assume this is why von Berghoff was less suspicious of our story. We'd found that the bandits were occupying Nabokov and holding Lord Jaromir there captive. Upon hearing this, von Berghoff declared a feast was to be prepared for the evening, and we would set off to raid Nabokov in the morning with his men. After getting absolutely plastered at the banquet that night, I was so hammered that I couldn't even fathom lying down in my bed until the world stopped spinning. Before setting off in the morning, though, I was tasked with getting Capon some armor and a sword from the grumpy old blacksmith I helped out earlier. He'd end up giving me the bottom of the barrel from their armory since he's a total dick, forcing me to waste my money and time repairing it up to an acceptable standard for Hans. Once that was taken care of, we were off to Nebekov to liberate it and confront these bandits. Unfortunately, the bandits were one step ahead of us, and later we'll kind of find out how, and successfully ambushed us in the woods on our way there. Now, getting to the bandit leader fight while keeping Hans alive was a bit more of a task than I remember it being, likely due to having absolute dick for stamina while being this loaded. Eventually, I would catch up to Hans to find him hurt and us being closed in on by the enemy, namely the bandit leader himself. Now, as I just mentioned, drunk, underleveled Henry has absolutely zero stamina. Okay, not absolutely zero, but very little. So a fair fight would have all the odds stacked against me here. Until I found the key to mastering drunken Henry combat, that is, and this is how that went. After all of those slices to the body, I somehow managed to poke this dude's eye out, causing him to call off the fight. His surrender awarded me with the respect of this bandit leader, but this by no means meant we were out of the woods. Instead, he chose to take us as prisoners, as Hans was a nobleman who would fetch a decent ransom. Now, why I remained alive? Well, I guess he just saw something in me. We leave the story of our titular characters for a moment to check back into the progress of Godwin, and it picks back up with him arriving right around the time that this battle had just winded down. In the spirit of this run, or should I say in the schnapps of this run, no wait, spirit still works. Whatever. As soon as I get into control of Godwin, I downed whatever alcohol he had on him, because of course he does, and went about my business. I decided not to pray over the injured man, because let's be honest, he ain't making it, and would just set off on Bibiana over to where the battle had taken place. I'd come across a few men cleaning up the bodies in the surrounding areas of the bloodshed. Their leader would introduce himself as Eric, and after some dialogue was exchanged, we came to a potential agreement to free the boys I came here for. However, it's never that easy, and we're attacked by a completely different group of bandits looking to loot whatever was left behind. Now, Godwin is a rightful badass with a sword, so we handle this group pretty easily. Though, I don't think this fight is ever supposed to be particularly hard. After this easy victory, Eric had a bit more respect for Godwin and was a bit more comfortable about bringing him to Nebekov to see what he could do about saving Hans and Henry. Now, Eric may have been fairly quick to trust, but this leader guy, not so much. He strongly resists Godwin's pleas for their release, or at the very least, proof that they were even alive. But to no avail. However, in an ironic stroke of luck, Nebekov became victim of another attack, prompting a perfect distraction for Godwin to get the best of the bandit leader. Though, he was just as prepared. In a stalemate, as a sign of trust, the bandit raised his dagger and proposed a deal with Godwin. If he helped defend the castle, he'd let the two of them go. I'm gonna skip all the clips for this one and just let you imagine what I did here. We're swapped back to Henry's story from here and get treated to a surprising reveal. Istvan Ta. The fucker who stole my father's sword fucked me over and got away with it at the end of the last game. He is a prisoner in the cell next to us, and Henry is so hung up on his revenge that he completely misses the diatribe that Istvan goes on about, describing how that he's a double agent and secretly working with von Bergov and this, that, and the other. And here's where we first get to find out the real name of the mysterious bandit leader, Jan Žižka. We'd quickly come to find where Eric had run off to and see that he'd come to free Istvan from his cell, hand him a weapon, and claim that they had to flee, leaving Henry and Hans to rot behind a locked door. Though, they wouldn't have to wait all that long, because after the fight had settled down, Godwin would make his grand entrance to the Henry and Hans plotline, and things would begin to look a bit brighter for the future. Finally, Henry, Hans, Žižka, and Godwin would have a moment to have a civil discussion, And after each of us provided the facts as we saw it from our angle, we began to piece together the lies and deception that we'd both been tangled up in. It turns out, we were actually on the same side the whole time, and were essentially tricked by two people working for the other side. What a fucking mess. After burying the last of the bodies with Godwin, I get introduced to a revolutionary device that certainly has no future ahead of it. It's called the pistol. If you haven't seen it, I made an entire video running this entire game with just these things. So if you want to see that, it exists. Anyway, after some shooting with the boys and lying down for hopefully some good rest, I'm forcefully ripped from my slumber against my will once again, and now there was even a bigger army showing up at our doorstep, led by none other than Von Owlets. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. This raid sequence, partly being that it's a fairly long sequence, went pretty rough. With an extremely inebriated Henry, sword fighting does not come easy. Also, remember when I'd said I'd seen some crazy bugs earlier in this game? Well, here's one of them. Too bad I couldn't actually fully exploit this, and it had no real application. Nor could I even recreate it. After an eventual reload of a previous save, I'd go on to fight the good fight. It seemed as if we were holding them back pretty darn well too. That was until the finger of God showed up and instantly shut us down. One direct hit from that was the end for us, and the four of us ended up being captured and taken back to Trotsky to afford me the karma I rightfully deserved.
I told you they should have made a run for it.
I stood my ground and endured all the torture that was thrown my way, but Godwin's empathy eventually got the best of him, and he spilled his guts on the information Toth was after. Shortly after leaving us to be watched by the two guards outside the cell, we'd hear a commotion happening out there. And eventually the door would swing open, and there I would see a lovely pair of Catherine. Turns out, she is also a double agent who's really working for Zizka. Come on guys, keep up. Story's not even half over. Once I'm freed, I downed a few cups of wine to get nice and unsober, then went about looking for Istvan. And some keys, or whatever. Henry's lust for revenge is just too much, and surely the alcohol isn't helping, so I snuck my way up to Istvan's quarters and confronted him once and for all. And after all of this, I decided to give him the courtesy of a chance to fight me fairly. And what a mistake that was. So it turns out that's not happening. Well, time to just toss him out the window then. After he was dealt with, I continued my search for my missing items and the keys to the castle so I could get into and through the secret tunnels. Before I could head down there though, I lastly had to sneak over to the other side of the castle, meet up with Godwin, and look around for Sigismund's orders to von Bergov. Once we got to the exit and saw that there were guards everywhere patrolling around the woods, Zizka decided that he would hang back and rest, tasking me with finding his contact, Mika, and signaling to him with the code word. I somehow, through this blurry-ass vision, stumbled my way over to find Mika, took out his captor, untied him, and uttered the password successfully. Now, I found Mika pretty easily, right? Well, his brother and the rest of his group were quite the opposite. I stumbled around this rocky terrain for like a solid 21 minutes before actually finding them. And after another nightmare sequence, we're finally on the road to Kuttenberg, with our first stop being at one of Zizka's old acquaintances in Suckdal. In Suckdal, we get a chance to reunite with Margrave Jobst and catch him up on all the happenings since we've gotten into Troskowitz. We expressed our concern for Liechtenstein, but he kind of just hand waves that away and even offers to take me back home on their next trip to Rate. I go on to decline his offer, as I have plenty here to keep me busy. Namely, Hans is still being held captive by von Bergov. I left with Zizka to accompany him to the Devil's Den and check in on whoever was left from his past who may be able to help us rebuild. And just as we're arriving, one of his old pals, Kubenka, is being thrown out of the bar by some men who he'd likely cheated out of coin in a game of dice. We intervene to save him from death, killing 4 men to save the 1. In order to begin rebuilding, we first needed to find the Dry Devil, but he was being held as a prisoner. He apparently got caught and was finally paying for his crimes. Well, Zizka, as per his MO at this point, has planned an ambush of a cart that was planning to transport the devil to another town. To help set this up, Kubenka and I needed to head out to an old camp of theirs that was somewhat nearby and had some weapons and ammo buried in it. In order to tolerate this drunken loudmouth Kubenka, I had to ensure that I too was sufficiently drunk. From there, I would just zone out, looking at the beautiful blurry landscape until we had arrived at the camp. Once here, I'd grab the shovel and I'd hoof it over to the spot where I knew the stash was buried. I wasn't going to tolerate any of Kubenka's nonsense. We got back to Zizka, handed over the guns, then we all set up beyond the tree line and waited for our target to arrive. Combat, while playing this game in this manner, becomes exponentially more difficult. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Henry has very little stamina, leading to most enemies being able to either one-shot me or combo me into oblivion. Now, since this game started me off with a pistol in my hands for this instance, I used the one round loaded in the barrel first for some good single target chunk damage. Then, my strategy was to third-party all of my allies' fights for a cheap but effective end of this battle. Now, once the fight was over, we'd all headed back to the Devil's Den and discussed our next plans. Turns out, I have to do nearly everything once again. Ever since the Devil was caught, his men had defected and all had kind of gone their own paths. It was up to me to round up as many of those men as I could and recruit them back into the troop. The first and closest former compatriot I'd run across would be Bahuta. He explained to me that he'd left that part of his life behind ever since his brother died, and now he's devoted his life to the church and had no desire to join back up with the devil. Out of respect, I just end up praying over his brother's grave with him. Though, while praying, decided to school him on the enunciation of a Latin phrase he was trying to speak, but my absolute butchering of it pisses him off enough to want to brawl. Guess he didn't leave all of that behind. Bro doesn't know that alcohol makes you super strong. After beating his ass, I left him alone to continue looking for the others. My next few leads would take me straight to Adder. Adder couldn't keep his namesake in his pants apparently, and found himself tempted by the man's wife. And remember when I said combat under these conditions is tough? Yeah, well, I was talking about a 1v1. This fight is a goddamn 5v1. Back in my gun-only run, I did find this one little spot that kind of messes with the AI and allowed me to fairly freely blast these dudes away. However, the sword is a completely different story. It definitely doesn't work as well, and I, no joke, spent about 40 minutes here and still couldn't manage to secure a victory. Whatever though, I have other men I need to recruit, so I'll come back to Adder later. Though, little did I know, I'd already started a countdown to Adder's death, so I had to work fast. Next, I went over to pull Raniak out of a pile of pig shit he'd find himself drowning in a few days ago, then rode around for a while, since I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do next. I didn't have high enough thievery to release the locks on the stocks, and the other two recruits involved fights that I'd be extremely outnumbered in. I went into Kuttenberg in hopes of securing a ranged option free of charge, since I figured it'd kind of be my only way to go forward. So, while in Kuttenberg, I walked into one of the shops selling archery equipment, sniped the Ash villager's bow right off the wall, and skedaddled the hell out of there and back over to seeing about saving Adder. It still took a couple of attempts to successfully kill them and cut him down, but it was still an eventual success. After this, I went over to talk to the bailiff Miskovitz to ask about a guy named Matthew who'd apparently been scamming people out of their groschen by claiming there's a toll for a nearby road. I'm asking about this guy because one of the guys I'm looking for is named Matthew. And while I was here, I figured I'd also stop by the stocks to talk with Janosch and see how I might be able to help him. Like I said, my thievery level is abhorrent, so lockpicking and pickpocketing are out of the question. Though, what's the one benefit of being inebriated again? Yeah, that's right. It makes me strong. Okay, it actually does quite the opposite. The negative state that I'm relegated to actually lowers my strength, but let's not worry about that. After freeing Janosch, there was only one remaining recruit to talk to, Matthew. And if only this dude had a fucking brain. All he wants is coin or violence. So I oblige him and his crew on the latter. Utilizing the bow I stole earlier, and pebbles of course, I lured them away from each other and took them out one by one. But it wasn't as simple as that. Pebbles was a scaredy horse and would buck me off whenever they'd come remotely close, and there are a lot of dudes here to take care of. Pause. This whole ordeal took me nearly an hour to finish, and it was probably one of the longest sections in this run. Once I joined everyone back at the Devil's Den, we polished off the night with some boozing and some medieval karaoke. I woke up with a mild hangover, but cured that with a bit of hair of the dog. And no, I'm not talking about the potion. Once I'm feeling loose again, I spoke with the devil, then set off to Kuttenberg to continue searching for Liechtenstein. Catherine's intel was a man named Goatskin who proved to be rather elusive and hard to find, and a good starting point she waved me to was the tavern the locals called the Hole in the Wall. A tavern? Say less. I found this dude Chaniak at this tavern, and in order to give up the information on Goatskin, I either A, had to pay him, or B, brawl with a massive mountain of a man named Goliath. After getting the absolute shit rocked out of me by this Goliath dude, I somehow managed to gain Chaniak's respect, and he decided to fill me in about Goatskin regardless of my loss. And I'm glad I didn't end up paying off Chaniak, since I barely had enough to cover the costly information from Goatskin. Now once I found him and paid him off for Liechtenstein, I tried to get my money back, but it turned out to be a bit more trouble than it was worth, so I eventually just let it be. From here, I wandered over to the Jewish quarter of Kuttenberg and ran into a man named Samuel, who kind of looks a little familiar, but I just can't place it. Anyway, this Samuel dude feeds me some information on a meeting place where I'd find what I was looking for, and says so with a look in his eye that just makes me instantly trust him. So I went to this meeting spot and waited until the meeting time, only for the doors to shut on me and get jumped by 2 armed men. Needless to say, they kicked my ass. While they were about to finish me off though, Samuel was inspecting the sword I was holding and seemed to recognize the symbol inscribed on it, and then suddenly changed his mind. They'd put a bag over my head and took me to where Liechtenstein was to see if he could identify me and back up my story. Turns out, he does. Go fucking figure. I tell my whole entire story again to Jan and catch him up to where we are now to notify him that there may be danger for him on the horizon. He gives me some advice on who to talk to if I wanted to help, as well as how to possibly free Hans. He points me to the Rutards. They actually used to live in Maleshov, but they're now posted up right inside Kuttenberg's walls. Now, upon my arrival to the Rutards, there seems to be a quarrel happening between the Lord and the mintmaster over some mining rights or something. It eventually escalates into an all-out battle that I somehow get wrapped up into. Now, this took a few attempts, but I eventually remembered from the last time I played that the enemy AI gets a little confused if you just head out the open door you came in from, so using that to my advantage, I was able to secure a victory. I explained my situation to the Lord, and even though I may have very well just saved his life, he's pretty unwilling to help me in rescuing Hans from Maleshov. That is, unless I could somehow obtain evidence of the mintmaster's mismanagement of the silver used to mint. I agreed and left there to speak with Christian of Pisek. He was the one in charge of the investigation of the missing silver, and I was sent to offer any assistance in said investigation. After moving to a more private location to talk, we came up with the story that I'm Christian's nephew and that I'm looking into getting into the mining business. This will be my way of getting the foreman to actually talk to me. I first met Samko. He was resting at a dice table and would only talk to me if I played around with him. Now, I lost miserably, but it was still enough to get him talking. Frank would only talk to me if I got him enough alcohol for him and his crew, and Paul really just requested that I pray with him at the grave of his nephew who recently died in a mining accident. After acquiring all the mined silver totals from all 3 foremen, I reported back to Christian, who then told me to question both Fett and Herman on this matter as well. Herman was a bit rough around the edges, so I went and got most of my information from Fett. To finish up this quest, I needed to talk with Baresh and Grund and discreetly ask him how much silver he'd received from the mines on the day of the Feast of St. Petronilla. However, he only talks to people who look like nobility, And Henry ain't it, fam. This led me to the alternative of taking a look around the tightly guarded smelter. After sneaking in, I'd talk to a few smelters who would point me towards a man named Shima. This Shima didn't want to talk within the walls of the smelter, so we head out to talk a bit more privately. He gives me some information about the head smelter Volkmar and said he'd recently bought an entire stable in Grund and was wondering how he'd got so much money to do so. This did seem suspicious, so I approached Volkmar to ask him a few questions, and this man just seems a bit too defensive. Eventually, his goons would show up and try to pick a fight with me, while Volkmar would just run off. But after a few times of being bludgeoned to death by these guys, I just decided to skip the conversation with Volkmar and just snipe him in the head with my crossbow. Then, once again in the back for good measure. And sure enough, he'd have a map to a secret mint in his possession. So I went off to find it. Once I'd located it, I took out the guard posted out on the surface, then went inside to find Buresh, along with a couple more guards, seemingly unsurprised to see me here. After I conned him out of as large of a bribe as I could, I went to work disabling his guards one by one, eventually ending his life as well and freeing the enslaved minters. And with the evidence I found on Buresh's body, this was sure to be enough proof for Lord Rutard. And when I'd returned to the Rutard Palace with the news, Kunzlin seemed elated. But that was cut short rather quickly, as the mintmaster had once again come to harass the Rutards. I confront him about everything I now know, and the man plays it off like it was nothing, since Buresh is no longer alive to testify against these crimes. Oops. Once again, he threatens us with warfare as I'm thrust back into battle with the mintmaster and his men. This is another one of those fights that's kinda rough, and you either get lucky and your allies don't die very quickly, or you do your best to third-party their fights and give them the upper hand. Or, in the best case scenario, you do both. Now this fight, really, is about getting to the mintmaster and killing him as quickly as possible. Though, this is not exactly easy. Plenty of his men don't want you to do that. Eventually, like a D1 linebacker, I saw my hole, I shot the gap, and I rushed the quarterback for a clean sack. Now that the mintmaster was officially injured and surrendering this time around, he cowers like a little submissive bitch, and agrees to whatever terms we set up for him. Though, we aren't unreasonable people. Thankfully, the Rutards would hold up their end of the bargain, and Rosa gave me directions into finding the secret pathway into Maleshov. I first met with the stablemaster nearby Maleshov, as Rosa said he would likely be able to provide me with some transportation as soon as we'd made it out of there. He would agree and leave a few horses at a designated location, but it doesn't matter since I didn't end up using them. Sorry, brother. After drunkenly stumbling through the forest, I eventually made it to the location to where I was supposed to begin digging. The only problem was, I didn't have a shovel. Luckily, there's one at the stables I was just at, so I grabbed it from there and went back to uncover the tunnels into Maleshov. As I'd come out on the other side, I'd find that von Bergov, Eric, and von Alitz were discussing their next plans, going on to say that they're using Hans as a bargaining chip to keep Hanush at bay. Then, out of nowhere, a messenger would arrive with news of Toth's death, and we'd get this absolute cinema from Eric.
That's not possible. That's a lie. It is true, Lord Toth is dead.
Who? Speak!
The messenger said something about Cobbler's bastard and some outlaws.
I swear, by everything that is holy, I will find that whoreson, and I will rip out its heart!
High-key, fantastic moment. I found Hans and his French cellmate up at the top of the tower, and I was only able to secure enough arms for Hans. And these two would end up staying back as I cleared my way to the stables for a clean exit out of here. On our freedom ride into the sunrise, we'd run across none other than Hanush and Radzig themselves. They were on a ride to Raborsh for a meeting with a bunch of King Wenceslas supporters. After explaining everything that's happened so far, for the third time, we parted ways with the lords, and I'm told to find a way to infiltrate the city council meeting being held by Sigismund and Kuttenberg. So I went to talk to the only guy I knew who would have any information on this meeting, the mintmaster. After threatening this beaten down little sad sack just the slightest bit, he agrees to help me and offers up a possible way to get in. His cook's son has a position serving there, and he said I could have it. Well, sort of. I still would have to convince the kid to let me take his place and whatnot, and it did end up costing me 1,000 groschen to do so. After getting dressed in my new clothes, no shoes by the way, I went to report for duty. However, I apparently couldn't do this job drunk, and the dude told me I had to go sober up before I would be allowed to work, paying no mind to the blood and dirt all over my face. So I went and bought a hair of the dog potion, drank it, then began my mission of playing Wine Waiter Simulator. Beyond this, we jump back into the life of Godwin at Raborsh. There's mostly just kind of like rehashing going on here. We do get introduced to a few new characters, but what I really enjoyed from this segment was the dynamic between Godwin and his father. Father? Yes, father. Which is then later doubled down on when they eventually get a satisfying resolution. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. After switching back to Henry, we get some insight as we attend a private meeting between Sigismund and von Alitz describing their current moves, as well as some future ones. Getting whiplash once more, we jump back to Godwin as the events described by Sigismund and von Alitz begin taking place at Raborsh. An army of men came to attack this gathering with the intention of doing as much destruction as possible. I do my best to put up a good defense of the castle until I'm switched back to Henry, oh my god, who's arriving right in the middle of it. As I gain control, I pour both the mead and the schnapps I have in my pocket down my throat and draw my sword to begin fighting my way inside. And as if you thought this game couldn't have any more twists and turns, we learn here that Samuel is actually our long-lost stepbrother, or I'm his adopted brother. I don't know. Martin is Samuel's dad. We learn that. Henry also informs them of the plans that Sigismund laid out right in front of him, going on to say that they're going to target the Jewish quarter of Kuttenberg and try and flush out Jan. Acting fast, we snuck through some underground tunnels that led straight to the inn I'd originally reunited with Jan at. There were a few enemies in here, but one could be taken out easily and stealthily in the kitchen, and the other two can be managed by keeping them both on the stairs and utilizing my overwhelming clinch technique to kill them. Once that's cleared, I can move out into the city and try and locate Samuel's mother. As soon as I found her, I escorted her through the back alleyways and back to where Samuel was. He was outnumbered in a 2v1 fight, so I joined in to even the odds. After those two were dealt with, we continued ushering as many people into the synagogue as we could, while standing our ground in the alleyway, preparing to meet our maker. Now, you may remember this from my last KCD2 video, if you watched it, that I had a pretty rough time with this fight in particular. With the guns, it was rough, but while plastered, it's a nightmare. I think the only reason I got past this section was because I got pushed through some objects somehow and the enemy just simply couldn't reach me. So I pulled out my crossbow and just started shooting them. Once we made our escape, I met back up with Žižka at the Devil's Den to report, getting orders to wait for Samuel to return back from Kolin. At our meeting the next day, I learned that Catherine has been sent in to spy on Sigismund's temporary camp nearby, and that I'm going to be sent in too to learn and report to her about when and where they're going to be moving the massive cannon that nearly took out Nebekov. Getting into this camp was as easy as paying my way in, just a mere 500 groschen. Sure, it's a steep price, but I don't need it. Alcohol is relatively cheap. I made my way over to the baths to talk with Catherine and reluctantly let her bathe me as it's the only way we can have any privacy. Once we'd finished our meeting, I went up to the captain's quarters to become enlisted into their service. My first task is to locate some soldiers who were carrying some orders into a neighboring town, but never made it. I was ordered to find them, or at the very least, the ledger they were carrying. Before leaving, I stopped by Moose's to talk with him briefly, and then set off to find those soldiers. I eventually stumbled upon an abandoned-looking shack, and lo and behold, they were in it. I told them that I'd cover for them as long as I could just have the parchment back, and they agreed. After bringing the charter back to Katz, I immediately ratted out the deserters, got paid, and then got invited to get drunk off my ass with him and Musa. We ended up having a hell of a good night. That is, until we stumbled upon what looked to be a murder scene. A huge argument erupts and accusations go flying, and it all comes down on me, as Katz puts me in charge of investigating this potential crime before the trial commences tomorrow. Through my investigation, I found some suspicious items in Crow's tent. Well, they were actually the exact items used to make the poison that killed the victim, so kinda damning. During the trial the next day, I stood there to defend Musa and rightfully accused Crow, though this man wasn't going out without a fight. As soon as this trial/execution wrapped up, Katz was ready to load up and move out with the finger of God. So I stopped by the baths to quickly warn Catherine, then back up to Katz to head out. Now, if you're playing this game in a very specific way, like I am, you'll generally end up developing one strategy that works and then you stick to it, since very little is effective otherwise. Well, during this fight, the strategy remained. Keep my allies alive by third partying, and don't die myself. Now that we had the cannon, it was time to plan our assault on Maleshov. I waited until the next morning with Zizka, where he would go over the plan in front of everybody. Later that night, the Dry Devil, myself, and a few others were on our way to begin the night raid on foot first. The Devil was gung-ho about torching this place to the ground and risking innocent civilians' lives, but I staunchly opposed that method. This led to an argument and eventually a duel between the two of us that would decide whose plan we'd go with. And this is how that went.
Fight or die!
Well. The bastard taught the devil to dance.
The raid started off fairly well. We breached the walls via ladder without anyone noticing, and I was able to lure the guards at the front door away long enough to open it up behind their backs. But this is where things got dicey. I'd end up getting critically struck by one of the enemies in front of me and had only like 7 HP to my name at this point. But I held on, I stuck it out, and switched up to being a backup archer. Through trial and error, we'd eventually succeed and went on to confront von Berghoff. The only way we were able to convince him to surrender was to threaten to torch the place to the ground with him inside of it, even though he did have Rosa Ruthard with him. Once he surrendered, they'd hauled him off to Suckdal, and I was commanded to meet them back there. I'd had a few hours before the council meeting was actually supposed to start, so I took the liberty to rest and regain some of my health back and get some color back onto the screen. I woke back up in the streets of Kuttenberg, so I had to ride back into Suckdal and continue the story. This council concluded with the plan of me and Rosa being sent off to get into the Kuttenberg Ruthard Palace via a secret backdoor entrance. Man, these Ruthards and their secret passages. As soon as we were inside the estate, Rosa split up with me to climb the lattice into her room and assist me from above with her crossbow. Spoiler, she doesn't do shit. So, aside from the adder fight earlier, this fight is up there with one of the most difficult fights under this rule set. Yet another 40-minute fight. Once I was sure that I was safe, I went down to the cellar to rest off my wounds and waited for reinforcements to arrive. Our master plan now, rob the Italian court. Now, how in the hell were we gonna do that? Well, step one would be getting in, right? Well, for that, we would need the key, and the only person we knew who would have such a key would be the mintmaster. So I skipped on over to his place and found Christian there rummaging around instead. He calls me out and wasn't too happy for me ratting out the skimming operation, and prompts him to call his 2 guards up here to help them fight me. Now, 3v1s aren't fair, so to even the odds here, I took the liberty of taking out his 2 guards first, then went up to confront him. Once he was dealt with, I located the key in a super secret hiding spot, then went back to report to Jan. Sam and I were sent down into the Rutard's crypt in an attempt to find a wall that was shared with that of the Italian court, which I found easily enough. But now for the uncertain part, convincing the Italian cardinal to help us out. He takes off running almost immediately after being confronted, and after nearly catching him, the cutscene was triggered and Adder accidentally killed him with his thick skull. With an assist from a poorly placed rock, of course. Well, that leads us to plan B. Godwin's now the cardinal. I stocked up on alcohol, practiced some Italian, then we set off for our visit to the Italian court. Now, given the circumstances, this plan couldn't have gone any better. As Godwin, I managed to hear out every faction on what they wanted out of this deal and came to a fairly decent compromise. Well, in my eyes at least. Switching over to Henry's part in this whole thing though, I needed to take out all the guards patrolling around the courtyard. There's about 6 or 7 of these dudes, and as long as I can get behind them and catch them off guard, I shouldn't have any problems. The problem I run into comes from the patrols, and not getting caught by any other guard during any executions. Eventually, I would manage to take them all down, regroup with the others, but we'd find that we were missing Adder. He was probably off fucking around. Oh, I didn't mean that literally. I luckily was able to talk my way out of a fight with the aggravated husband of this woman using a totally random Italian phrase that I was taught right before coming here. Once we were all together again, we went down to the adjoining wall and tore it down to let the rest of our party in. We interrupted the council, reunited with Godwin, and basked in the glory of all the silver we now had access to. Before we could leave though, I made sure to keep the promise to Rosa about making sure her father was freed, along with all the other captive lords. Though, right on cue, just as we were winning, Eric just had to show up with his Prager friends and spoil our fun. During the first few moments of this fight, just as I was pushing the ladder down with my halberd, I was struck multiple times, causing my health to crater to 1. I had enough bandages to stop the bleeding, but I was out for the rest of this fight. Thankfully, they didn't need me, and this fight wrapped up rather suspiciously quickly, actually. Musa saved my life as we were trying to escape, and just as we're getting the last of the silver loaded back up the Rutards, Brabant double crosses us and takes off while his men slow us down with a fight. Bastard. After all was settled and we were licking our wounds, it would be revealed that Adder had been mortally wounded and wasn't going to make it. Now, I didn't grow a huge attachment to Adder through my time with this game, but the emotions from everyone else sells this scene. Oh, and that's not all. Kubyanka's horse takes a dive on our escape, and Musa is shot in the chest. But most of us would make it back to Sukdal alive, and surprisingly enough, Musa pulls through. After taking some time to converse with everyone, a sudden Kubyanka would appear at our gates, and came with a message for me specifically. Eric was challenging me to a duel, a 1v1 in Sigismund's old camp. At first, I took him up on this offer, and failed. Like a lot. To the point to where I just said, fuck it. Let's see what happens if I don't. I just imagine Eric sitting there, endlessly sharpening a sword until the end of time. Anyway, upon a savory load and denying the request this time, I jumped immediately into the Prager showing up at Sukdal's doors, demanding the silver. So, this battle, and I know it's gearing up to the end and all that, but holy fuck. I swear that this whole fight is completely up to the ally AI doing a good enough job that Henry doesn't have to do absolutely everything. Well, want to know what my solution was? I ran. And I hid. I went to the house nearby, climbed to the top of the ladder, and just waited there, waiting for the enemies to come pouring in. I assumed I'd just knock them down off the top of this ladder as soon as they got up it, and that was my plan. However, after about 3 minutes of just waiting around, no one came. So I went over to the window to see what was happening, and nothing. All of my allies had been defeated, and just my enemies remained standing. But that's all they were doing. Standing. So I went over to investigate. Turns out I kind of froze the game or something. All of the ladders had been knocked down, and the enemies that remained wouldn't take any damage from my sword, but they couldn't escape death forever. As soon as they were all dead, the mission would complete and I could finally move on. 1 hour and 10 minutes was spent on this single mission trying to solve it. Brutal. Continuing our defense, we also began working towards a few somewhat offensive plays. I was now in a sort of leadership position and got to go about recruiting a few men in my fire team so we could have separate watch shifts throughout the night. However, while making my rounds to check on my men, I stumbled upon a small secret raid taking place in the outer bailey. I would take care of the ladders while the others would fight off the invaders. It's now day 11 of this siege, and we're all together discussing where we should go from here. Like I said, we were planning some offensive moves. We would get a prisoner from that failed raid of theirs, and with his intel, we could formulate a little raid of our own. I recruited a few men for this raid, selecting the ones I never really got to know, as they were labeled as disposable to me. I now completely run out of alcohol at this point because the game wants to simulate starvation, but I'd still managed to sniff out the bottomless wine barrel located in the kitchen. And the raid we planned would end up being a success as I'd rain cover fire with a crossbow from above. Jumping forward in time some more, and we're truly running out of food. It's so bad that I'm even thinking of eating the stray dog wandering around. And actually that's not a bad idea. Except I can't get the meat cooked by any means. Now I thought I could take it to the devil and he would cook it, because I thought that's what he said he would do, but there was no prompt. Oh well, I just decided in the end to just cut the cord and refuse to get Cape on some food. These last few fights are some of the toughest, again, because the AI is just sometimes super bad. And in this case, I could find no path to success in any conventional way. I would just get swamped by enemies coming up the ladders over and over and over again. So I did a similar trick as the one I did on the outer bailey fight. I ran and hid. And it worked. Again. No shot. There were still a few tough enemies to navigate through before knocking down the final ladders, and once this was over, we regrouped and things were starting to feel super dire. We needed a Hail Mary. A plan was proposed to sneak into the enemy camp, steal one of their horses, and ride it off to hopefully find the Margrave and bring back the army he'd promised. Sam and I were the ones who volunteered for the job. I'd say my goodbyes to everyone, and with that, we set off to the task. Though Samuel would ditch me almost immediately. Now I'm missing some footage from sneaking into the camp for some reason, but let's just pick back up my fight with Brabant. It was more than apparent that he outclassed me with the sword, and even my classic clinch spam tactic wasn't working. So I looked into my other option, which was a crossbow, and decided to give it a shot. Though that didn't work either. But I did discover that I could drop down there without him knowing, sneak up behind him, and stab him through the chest. Then I could free Samuel, sneak out of the camp to the horses, and ride off with Samuel to save the day. Hold on, I did say that I would revisit this section at the beginning of this video, but honestly, is it really that necessary? If you've played the game, you know what happens. This video's already getting far too long. Eventually, Henry does show up with an army, and I'm back in control of him again, fighting my way down to my allies. The first guy I'd come up to wasn't a fan of my clinch method, so I had to use all 3 of my remaining bolts for the crossbow. After lowering the gates, 3 enemies would spawn in my path downwards, and somehow I'd managed to walk by all 3 of them without getting locked into a duel or even hit. Guess Henry just got that aura. Anyways, I made it down to the courtyard, looted some moonshine off a dead body, then got pissed drunk as I watched my allies carry us on to victory. Not much gameplay happens on from here, mostly just story stuff and lore wrap-ups, so this is where I'm gonna officially call the run. Drunk Henry, especially on hardcore with all negative perks, is surely a challenging experience. I can't say that it was horrible, because watching a plastered Henry waver around in a cutscene is fucking hilarious to me, but other than that, the blurred vision and tilting camera is often quite nauseating. I'd say if you wanted to try a drunken Henry run for yourself, stick to the positive phase of drunkenness. Anyways, I love Kingdom Come Deliverance, and actually going through this playthrough and really engaging with the story in a meaningful way was a much better experience than just blazing through it. The game just feels far too long if you're just rushing through everything. I hope y'all enjoyed this video, and as I said, I may be uploading a bit less frequently these days, but I'll do my best to make sure they're good ones. And I'll keep you updated as much as I possibly can over on Discord or in the community post, or wherever. I'll keep you updated. Anyway, love ya. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.